World War I did not begin with a gunshot. It began with a balance sheet. The assassination in Sarajevo is remembered as the spark, but sparks only ignite systems that are already unstable. By 1914, Europe's great powers were not simply rivals. They were heavily indebted states locked into a financial system that could no longer sustain itself without expansion or war. Long before the first shot was fired, Europe's great powers were already trapped in a financial crisis of their own making. Decades of borrowing to build empires had pushed governments into a system that could no longer sustain itself. The assassination did not cause the war. It triggered a financial system already under extreme strain, one where mounting debts turned rivalry into necessity, and war became the only mechanism left to reset an unsustainable order. Our story kicks off in the 1850s, when European powers stumbled onto something that would reshape everything. They realized you could borrow capital to expand an empire much faster than you could earn it through traditional conquest. Britain pioneered this approach using enormous loans to lay railways throughout India, construct naval installations across 6 continents, and support the largest fighting force the planet had ever witnessed. The arrangement functioned beautifully as long as the empire continued expanding and producing fresh revenue sources. But here's where the mathematics becomes lethal. By 1914, Britain's government debt had swollen to £650 million, a staggering figure requiring careful interest payment management and perpetual refinancing. France, Germany, and Russia adopted identical playbooks. Each borrowing aggressively to finance their own imperial dreams. They believed they were engaged in territorial expansion. In reality, they were entering a system governed by compound interest and long-term obligations. Consider your own home loan. For a moment, you probably worked out monthly payments carefully, verified you could manage the interest rate, maybe even secured pre-approval before shopping. Now picture your neighbor also purchasing properties, and your other neighbor buying even larger properties, and suddenly you felt compelled to acquire more properties just to stay competitive. That's precisely what occurred among Europe's great powers, except rather than properties, they were purchasing battleships, standing armies, and whole continents. Germany offers the most striking illustration of this imperial debt vortex. Under Kaiser Wilhelm, German borrowing exploded as the country attempted to challenge British naval superiority while simultaneously constructing railways throughout Africa and claiming colonies in the Pacific. The German administration persuaded itself that each fresh territorial gain would finance itself through resource extraction and commerce revenues, sound recognizable. It's identical reasoning that fed our housing crisis in 2008. The conviction that climbing asset values would perpetually cover climbing debt. The genuine shock arrives when you examine the Ottoman Empire, serving as a preview of what occurs when imperial debt spirals beyond control. In 1875, the Ottoman administration announced bankruptcy carrying debts totaling £200 million. Here's the stunning part. Their yearly debt obligations exceeded half their national income. European lenders didn't simply forgive the deficit, they formed the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, granting foreign bondholders direct authority over Turkish tax gathering and government expenditure. Pause and absorb that. A sovereign empire lost significant financial autonomy to international creditors. Ottoman sultans could still don their ritual robes and maintain their elaborate titles, but genuine financial choices got executed in London, Paris, and Berlin. This wasn't merely debt reorganization. This became an early model for modern financial dependency. What happened to the Ottoman Empire was not an exception. It was a warning of what debt could do to sovereignty across Europe. The Declaration of London in 1914 formalized this risky arrangement, officially acknowledging credit as a critical component of the Anglo-French-Russian alliance. Military partnerships were now explicitly connected to financial partnerships. When you enlisted as an ally, you weren't simply committing to battle together, you were committing to borrow together, securing each other's obligations and distributing the financial hazards of imperial rivalry. By 1914, every significant European power was caught in the identical impossible circumstance. They carried massive debts demanding constant territorial growth to maintain, but territorial growth demanded even heavier borrowing, generating even larger debts. The arrangement had become mathematically unstable. Something needed to break. Either these empires would discover methods to dramatically boost their revenues, or they would confront financial ruin. War, as it happened, provided both a resolution and a justification. Military triumph would grant access to enemy lands and resources, potentially addressing the revenue challenge. Military urgency would validate levels of government borrowing that would be politically unthinkable during peacetime. Most crucially, war would permit governments to restructure their complete financial connections with both their own populations and their international lenders. Those European monarchs weren't building empires. They were accumulating liabilities that would ultimately devour everything they professed to safeguard. Why was J.P. Morgan Jr., an American financier, arranging military supply agreements for European armies 2 years before America even joined the fighting? Britain wasn't simply funding its own war, it was funding most of the empire's costs, all of Italy's war expenses, and 2/3 of what France and Russia were spending on their military campaigns. Think about that for a moment. One nation was essentially financing a world war involving numerous countries. How does that even function financially? The explanation lies in a network of international banking connections that most people have never learned about, but which shaped the destiny of millions. In 1915, Morgan assembled a syndicate of 2,200 American banking institutions to arrange a $500 million loan to the Allied nations. But here's the remarkable part. This wasn't simply a loan. Every single British munitions acquisition had to pass through Morgan companies, granting American financiers direct authority over European military purchasing. Quick question. When a foreign bank manages your military supply network, are you still a sovereign country, or have you transformed into something else completely? Britain, the empire controlling a quarter of Earth's land area, had essentially contracted out its war financing to Wall Street. The Lion was borrowing capital from the Eagle to purchase ammunition. But the truly astonishing element is what occurred to interest charges during this stretch, as European administrations borrowed increasing amounts to fund their military campaigns. The borrowing cost kept climbing. Higher interest charges meant that territorial expansion wasn't simply politically attractive, it was mathematically mandatory. You required fresh revenue sources merely to maintain your existing debt, let alone finance fresh military operations. France and Russia discovered themselves in an especially precarious situation. Their gold holdings, which had been overshadowing those of the Bank of England according to financial documents from the era, became vital leverage in alliance discussions when you're discussing military coalitions. You're not simply promising to battle together, you're promising to distribute the financial weight of maintaining each other's government solvent. Here's where it becomes almost surreal. Germany's Reichsbank was supplying short-term credit to the administration, while war loans consolidated long-term debt, generating what financial scholars now identify as an early version of debt monetization. The German administration was essentially creating money to pay interest on capital. It had already borrowed to finance military campaigns that were supposed to produce enough plunder to repay the original loans. Does this sound recognizable? It's the identical cycle that prompted our 2008 financial catastrophe, except rather than mortgage-backed securities, European powers were wagering on victory-backed securities. Each fresh military operation was supposed to finance itself through territorial seizure, resource extraction, and compensation payments from defeated adversaries. The Bank of England, Rothschilds, Barings, Morgans, Kleinworts, and Schroders, London's 5 major merchant banks, controlled international investment projects and possessed enormous financial interests in European conflict outcomes. These institutions were financially exposed to the outcomes of the conflict, not merely supplying banking assistance, they were active contributors whose bond holdings relied on particular military results. Let me frame this with a contemporary illustration. Imagine if Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan Chase, and Bank of America had each loaned billions to different parties in a regional struggle, with loan conditions relying on who prevailed. Now picture these banks also managing the weapons providers for each party. Do you believe those banks would stay neutral, or would they possess strong motivations to shape the result? That's precisely what unfolded in Europe between 1914 and 1918. International lending had generated mutual reliances where creditor countries possessed invested interests in their debtors' military achievement. Now we arrive at the section of the narrative that completely alters how you comprehend America's position in World War I. You've likely heard that the United States attempted to remain neutral until German submarines compelled our involvement. That's the official account. The genuine account involves a man named J.P. Morgan Jr. and the largest financial wager in human experience. Picture Morgan in his Wall Street workspace in 1915, encircled by European maps covered in red markers indicating battlegrounds where American capital was financing the bloodshed. By this moment, Morgan had arranged loans totaling $1.5 billion to the Allied forces. That's roughly $35 billion in contemporary currency, but here's what makes this absolutely extraordinary. Morgan wasn't simply lending capital, he was essentially operating Britain's complete military acquisition operation from Manhattan. Every British munitions acquisition, every French artillery request, every Russian rifle agreement had to pass through Morgan companies. The individual who managed Allied weapons provisions was an American financier whose earnings relied on maintaining the conflict going long enough for the Allies to triumph conclusively. Consider the conflict of interest here. Morgan possessed every financial motivation to block peace discussions that might terminate the conflict before the Allies could produce enough plunder to repay their American loans, but Morgan was merely the start. By 1917, the circumstance had intensified far beyond private banking. The United States Treasury was providing massive loans directly to European administrations. With America lending more than $10 billion to foreign countries, an astronomical figure that transformed the worldwide financial structure overnight, the United States shifted from being a net international debtor of $3.2 billion in 1914 to becoming the planet's largest creditor country by 1918. Here's where the timing becomes questionable. The Federal Reserve, America's central banking arrangement, was established in 1913, merely 1 year before the conflict began. Coincidence? The Fed supplied the institutional structure that made massive war debt monetization feasible. Without the Federal Reserve's capacity to expand the money supply and coordinate with private banks, the magnitude of American lending to Europe would have been financially unthinkable. Let's discuss what this signified in practical terms. American entry into the conflict wasn't simply about submarines or diplomatic strains by 1917. American banks and the U.S. administration had loaned so much capital to the Allied forces that an Allied defeat would have triggered the largest financial catastrophe in American experience. Morgan and his partners weren't simply hoping for Allied triumph, they were desperately required it to prevent bankruptcy. Consider this scenario. You've loaned your life savings to a friend who's in a confrontation with someone else. If your friend loses the confrontation, you never witness your capital again. If your friend prevails, you retrieve your capital back with interest. Are you going to remain neutral in that confrontation, or are you going to do everything feasible to assist your friend prevail? That's precisely the position America discovered itself in by 1917. The transformation was remarkable. In merely 3 years, the United States shifted from neutral observer to active contributor, not because of political ideology or military approach, but because of financial exposure. American entry transformed inter-allied credits from a hybrid public-private network into direct government-to-government lending connections with the United States as the ultimate worldwide creditor. But here's the element that should genuinely seize our focus. While European forces were bleeding themselves to exhaustion in trenches, American industrial capability was exploding. Now we reach the moment when the complete financial structure of cards becomes visible. and you'll comprehend why the war to terminate all wars actually formed. The permanent, debt-based international arrangement we're still operating under today, what occurred after the armistice wasn't peace. It was the largest debt reorganization operation in human experience disguised as treaty discussions. Here's the shocking reality. By 1919, the United Kingdom's national debt had exploded from £76 million in 1914 to £7,481 million by the conflict's termination. That's more than 10 times the original figure. France, Russia, and Germany confronted similar debt explosions that made normal peacetime governance financially unthinkable. These weren't simply large numbers, they represented obligations that would consume national budgets for generations. But the genuine revelation arrives when you trace the capital flow after Versailles. Germany was mandated to pay massive reparations to Britain and France. But here's the twist. Germany financed those reparation payments with loans from American banks. Britain and France then utilized German reparation currency to pay their debts to the United States. The complete arrangement was a circular debt structure where American banks were essentially lending Germany capital to pay reparations that would flow back to American creditors. Let me walk you through this financial manipulation, step by step. Between 1919 and 1932, Germany paid 19 billion gold marks in reparations to the Allied forces. During the identical stretch, Germany received 27 billion gold marks in loans from American banks. Germany was borrowing more capital than it was paying out, but the reparation payments established a legal structure for permanent financial supervision of German domestic policy. Consider what this signifies. The Treaty of Versailles functioned not only as a peace agreement, but also as a complex financial settlement that formed American financial institutions as the ultimate arbiters of European economic policy. German reparations, British war debt payments, and French reconstruction loans all flowed through the identical American banking networks that had financed the original struggle. The human expense of this structure was staggering, but it becomes worse when you realize that European administrations comprehended precisely what they were signing. According to financial documents from the era, European sovereigns had borrowed during the conflict, assuming they were protecting civilization, but they discovered that Americans treated international lending as business investment aimed at maximizing earnings rather than supporting allied countries. This generated a fundamental mismatch in expectations that would shape international relations for the following century. European forces expected debt forgiveness or favorable reorganization based on shared sacrifice and common principles. American creditors expected complete repayment with interest based on standard commercial conditions. When those expectations collided, the outcome was economic policies that prioritized debt maintenance over human welfare. The magnitude of this financial authority becomes evident when you examine how long these obligations persisted. The final installment of German World War I debt wasn't paid until October 3, 2010. Read that again. 2010, Germany spent 92 years paying for a conflict that lasted 4 years. British war debt payments to the United States continued until 2006. France didn't complete paying its World War I obligations until 2009. This signifies that people who were born decades after the armistice spent their complete working lives paying taxes to service debts incurred by administrations that had ceased to exist before their grandparents were born. The conflict had terminated, but the financial obligations established a permanent arrangement of international wealth transfer that operated regardless of shifting political circumstances. But here's the element that should genuinely make our blood boil. While ordinary Europeans spent the following century paying for this financial structure, the banking institutions that generated the debt vortex became more powerful and profitable than ever. World War I formed the template for contemporary sovereign debt catastrophes, where military struggles serve as opportunities for financial institutions to form permanent revenue sources through government indebtedness. The pattern repeats throughout the 20th century and persists today. International struggles generate emergency borrowing circumstances that permit financial institutions to form long-term authority over national economic policies. Debt maintenance requirements then shape domestic priorities for generations, regardless of democratic preferences or shifting political leadership. When you comprehend this arrangement, current events begin making more sense. Why do sovereign debt catastrophes always seem to result in austerity policies that benefit international creditors while imposing expenses on ordinary populations? Why do military struggles consistently prompt increased government indebtedness rather than decreased international strains? Why do peace discussions always involve complex financial structures that seem to matter more than territorial or political arrangements? The explanation is that World War I formed a precedent where international struggles serve primarily as debt consolidation exercises rather than political or territorial disputes. Contemporary conflicts aren't fought to resolve international disagreements. They're fought to generate financial obligations that produce permanent revenue sources for international creditors, those European monarchs we began with, gathering in ornate palaces with fountain pens poised over crucial documents, weren't signing treaties expanding their empires. They were signing loan arrangements that would ultimately bankrupt their countries and form a worldwide financial arrangement where human welfare became subordinate to debt maintenance requirements. The conflict to terminate all conflicts didn't terminate conflict. It made conflict financially profitable on a permanent basis. Every international struggle since 1918 has followed the identical basic pattern. Emergency borrowing generates long-term financial obligations that outlast the original political disputes by decades. We're not operating in a world shaped by the results of historical struggles. We're operating in a world shaped by the financial structures that funded those struggles, and that, more than any assassination or alliance arrangement or imperial competition, explains why our current international arrangement prioritizes financial stability over human security, debt maintenance over democratic governance, and creditor rights over national sovereignty. Financial systems emerged from World War I with a lasting influence that still shapes global economics today. If you want to understand how financial systems quietly shape history and how debt structures outlast wars themselves, subscribe to Economic History.